Now that we understand the V and the C of our application, the controllers and the views, let's go ahead and talk about models for a second. But before we jump into models, we need to set up our database, because remember, models are going to interact with our database. So let's head over to our .env file, and right here, this .env file is simply a declaration of constant variables in application. Okay, so this is where we're going to be configuring environment variables. So right here, app environment is set to local, means we are developing locally. The application key right here is needed for Laravel to work, and debug means true show applications. So right here we have just a list of environment variables to declare how we want our application to work. Okay, so right here the next section is the database, setting up a database for this particular application. So I'll go ahead and create a new database, and I'll call this database new project. Okay, and the next thing is to set up my username for this application, and I'll say it's root, and the username for my local database is root, and for my password is blank. Okay, so those are my credentials for my local machine. Go ahead and set your own up. If you're not using MySQL database, then you can use SQLite or you can use Postgre. Okay, those are those ones that are available for Laravel. So I've set up this. Next thing I need to do is actually create that database. Okay, so I'll head over to phpMyAdmin and I'll create a new database called new project. So now Laravel is automatically connected to that database. So we already set up our database with Laravel. Now we can go ahead and create a model that is going to interact with that database. Okay, one thing to understand with models is that a model is in charge of a particular table in a database. Okay, so it can do many other things, but understand it as one model for one database table. Now, how do we create database tables before creating models that are going to interact with them? Okay, we use what we call migrations in Laravel, which we're going to be reviewing in a bit. Okay, so now I'd like you to run PHP Artisan. And if we run PHP Artisan, we discover that we have a command called make model. And this is simply going to generate a new eloquent model class for us. Okay, so if we run that command, we should see a new class created for us. So I'll say PHP Artisan make model. And right here, we need to pass in a parameter, which is going to be the name of the model. Okay, so we are going to be building a to-dos list. So we need a to-dos table. And the convention for naming models is that the model name should actually be the singular of the database table. Okay, so we are going to create a table called to-dos, and the model that is going to be in charge is going to be to-do. Okay, so this is the convention we're going to follow. So right here, we need a model for our to-dos table that we're going to create. So I'll call it to-do right there. And I'll pass in an option, which is going to generate a migration for that table for us. So I'll put enter, and you see two stuff are created for us. One, the model is created, and two, the migration is created. Okay, so Artisan is helping us do this easily. So our to-do class is created, very simple. You can write this manually, but it's difficult. Artisan just makes that easy for us. And in our database migrations directory, we have a new migration called create to-dos table. Okay, so look at that convention right there. It's creating a to-dos table. So what are migrations in Laravel? These are simple classes that are going to create database tables for us, and right here we can define how we want to create those tables. Okay, so migrations are made up of two functions. One is the up function, so the up method, and two is the down method. Okay, so when we run a migration, which I'm going to show you how to do in a moment, it's going to run the up function. And if we want to actually delete that table or make some changes, it's going to run the down function. And look at this. On the schema class, it's going to drop the table to-dos if it exists as soon as we run the migration. Okay, so on the schema class, we are creating a to-dos table. So look at this. So on the schema class, we call a method called create, and the first parameter is the name of the table, and this is the to-dos table that we want to create. And the next thing, it receives a callback, and this is the blueprint of the table. How do we want to structure our table? And by default, we have an increments ID field, and we have timestamps, which are two fields I'm gonna show you in a moment. Okay, so we have an instance of the blueprint, and we're just calling methods on that instance that help us to create our table. Okay, so in this case, I'll show you a method, and this method is going to be called string. The name of that field or that column is going to be to do. So we have a string method, and this string method is going to create a string field in our database table. Okay, so we have a column, and this is string, and the name of that column is going to be to do. Okay, and if we want a boolean field, we'll call our table instance, and we'll call a boolean method right there, and we'll give the name of that column. So we'll say completed. Okay, and we can go ahead and do many things with migrations. There are a lot of methods, and I'm gonna use another method that we can chain right here. Okay, and if I want to set a default, which we can easily do in phpMyAdmin, in Laravel we just need to call a default method on that table column, and right here we'll pass in the default. So I'll say default should be 0. Okay, so on my boolean field called completion, the default for that field should be 0. And right here we have a string, and the name of that column is called to do. Okay, so that is the structure of our table using a Laravel migration. Now, how do we tell Laravel, okay, we are done creating our migration, go ahead and make this work in the database? So we just need to run php artisan migrate, and this is going to collect all our migrations, and it's going to send them to our database. Okay, so by default Laravel comes with a create users and passwords table, so just ignore that for the moment. But this is our migration that we created, our create to do's table. So let's go to our database that we created, and we refresh, and we discover that now we have 4 tables. Our migrations table is simply for Laravel, and Laravel is going to use that to track what database tables we've already created and all that. So these ones, the password resets and users, came by default with Laravel, but we'll not think about that for the moment. So right here we have our to-dos table, and you look at the structure of that table. We have an ID field, which is right here defined. So the increments, the ID right here, so it's an integer, and the next field was the string. So we have the to-do right here, which was a string, so it's a varchar right there. And remember, this one is increment, so it was auto increment. Okay, so the completed was a boolean, so right there you see it's a tiny int, and the default that we set to 0 right there, we set 0. Okay, so we have the timestamps, so we have 2 timestamp and timestamp created at and updated at. So there's no default, and right here you see that the structure of the table is exactly as we defined in our migration. So migrations simply help us create database tables as easily as possible. Okay, so in the next video we're going to talk about how to actually interact with our newly created database table.